Thank you for coming to this week's Smenas colloquium series. I'm very happy this week to have Michaela Rosensoltar with us. She is a graduate from anthropology here at University of Michigan. Her work, and she's currently a professor, sorry, just focusing on the past, and she's also a professor of anthropology at the University of Nevada at Reno. Her work focuses on mobility, religion, race, gender, and urban, in the urban Mediterranean, and some more recent work on European belonging through the lens of conversion. And she has a forthcoming book called Spain Unmoored, which deals with some of what we will hear in the talk. Please join me in welcoming Michaela. And just a quick announcement that at 1:30 the public portion of the talk will end, and we'll kind of break down into the class and have a further discussion there. Okay, thank you.
Thanks. Thank you, Joseph. How's this microphone? It's not blasting all of you?
You need to kiss the mic.
All right, well, I'll move this one up. They told me to use this one for the purposes of recording. You all hear me all right in the back? Okay. All right, well, thank you all for being here. And I'd like to start by thanking Joseph for inviting me, everyone who works at the center for organizing this event. I, as Joseph was saying, spent many happy days here as a grad student in anthropology, so it's extra fun to be back today. So I'm going to talk to you about your colloquium series theme of the trans-regional Middle East by talking about some historical and contemporary entanglements between the MENA region and Europe, and specifically by talking about Islam in southern Spain. So for the past decade or so, I've been studying Islam, migration, and historical memory in urban Andalusia, which is the southern part of Spain. And my research there looks at social encounters between Muslim migrants, European converts to Islam, and Catholic and secular Spaniards who live in Andalusia. And I work in a city called Granada, and I look at how people mobilize, I'm losing my voice today, sorry. I look at how residents of a city called Granada mobilize historical memories about medieval Muslim Spain as a way of kind of navigating renewed religious and ethnic pluralism in the city today. So let's see if this works. Yeah, so this is a map of southern Spain, and Granada is this city right here, right above this big green blob, which represents a mountain range. So Granada was the longest held territory of medieval Muslim Iberia. And then since the Inquisition has been predominantly a Catholic city, and since the 1980s has had a growing Muslim minority that's mostly made up of Muslim immigrants from Morocco and other parts of North Africa, but also converts to Islam who are from Spain and also from other parts of Europe. Non-Muslims in the city of Granada are really ambivalent about their Muslim history. Some people celebrate it as something that's formative to city and regional identities, and some people silence it as this kind of embarrassing and tragic Muslim occupation that has nothing to do with real Andalusian identity. Meanwhile, lots of Muslims in the city understand their arrival in Granada as a kind of diasporic homecoming. So they claim belonging in the city of Granada based on its Moorish history. So my ethnographic work looks at inclusion and exclusion of Muslims in the political and social life of the city. And I'm especially interested in some of the different ways that inclusion and exclusion happen for different groups of Muslims. So mainly converts and immigrants who really are incorporated into Spanish social life in different ways. And overall, the sort of underlying motivation for this work is an interest in how Europe's Muslim past continues to influence its present. So I use ethnography to question this increasingly common narrative that we hear about Europe, which describes Europe as sort of cohering today as a Christian turned secular space that has no room, no space for Muslim life. So I try and question that. In the other direction, though, I'm also trying to, through ethnography, trouble the equally sort of monolithic rosy narratives that say Spanish history of multiculturalism is this kind of easy answer to Europe's problems of multiculturalism. So to get at these issues anthropologically, this is just a sort of visual image of inclusion and exclusion. We have postcards next to Moorish architecture to lure tourists to the Moorish history of Andalusia, and also anti-immigrant graffiti, and these things are pretty much side by side all over the city. So to look at these issues ethnographically, I've been doing urban ethnography in Granada since the early 2000s in lots of different kinds of field sites. So everything from mosques to Muslim neighborhoods to Muslim women's associations, both convert and Moroccan associations, immigrant rights NGOs, and then lots of different kinds of spaces within the Moorish-themed tourism industry. So I know you guys are looking at the trans-regional Middle East this semester, so I'm happy to talk about any aspect of Islam in Spain that relates to that or that you're curious about during the discussion. But for now, I'm going to bite off kind of a smaller piece of the project and talk about how historical narratives of Islamic Spain reverberate today in the ways that Muslim converts and migrants claim belonging in the city of Granada, and then talk about some of the resulting tensions within the city's Muslim community. So first I'm going to trace some competing narratives of Granada's Muslim history, and then I'll talk about how in the context of those historical debates, different kinds of Muslims are differently incorporated as minorities in the city. And then finally I'll talk about some of the political consequences of this in intra-Muslim tensions. So in sort of true ethnographic fashion, I'll start with a quote from my fieldwork. So in 2008, I was interviewing this young woman named Lara, who's a young Spanish Muslim, and I asked her to tell me about relationships between Muslims and non-Muslims in the city of Granada, just generally. And she answered by comparing the past with the present and saying, before, people might have laughed and been like, oh, there go the Muslims, but they were mostly respectful. But now I see a lot more confusion. On a global level, there's all this media imagery of terrorists, and now people think of Muslims as terrorists. These days in Granada, you hear of really bad things, even acts of violence. It could be because there are so many Moroccans here now, and people think they're taking their jobs. So when this woman Lara was born in the 1980s, most Muslims in Granada were Europeans. They were mainly Spanish converts like her parents. Today, the Muslim minority is mostly migrants, especially from Morocco. And in this quote, this woman Lara was blaming rising racism on a kind of global antipathy toward Muslims, but she was also faulting the Moroccan population. She was sort of nostalgically invoking a past in which European converts had really monopolized the image of Muslims in Granada. Latifa, a Moroccan immigrant who I asked the same question to, answered that the first thing I needed to know as a researcher if I wanted to understand the situation of Muslims in Granada was that, quote, the Muslim community is divided between European converts and Muslim migrants. And other Muslims in Granada kind of consistently answered my questions about their relationships to non-Muslims by broaching these questions about differences within the Muslim community. So Muslims' sense of responsibility for representing Islam to their non-Muslim neighbors in Granada was a constant theme of conversation in my fieldwork. And these questions of intra-Muslim tensions usually came up when Muslims were talking with me about their efforts to sort of positively represent Islam in Spain. So these two women's comments hint at one of the main themes I'll talk about today, which is the idea that because of local ambivalence about the Moorish past, and because of the unequal ways that historical memory affects converts and migrants, Muslims in Granada experience their efforts to represent Islam to wider Spanish publics as really hinging on their ability to manage tensions within the city's rather diverse Muslim population. And that's largely because these tensions themselves really reflect the different status of convert and migrant Muslims as minority subjects. So to unpack that, sort of step by step, let's start with talking about some historical narratives. So recent scholarship on Islam and migration in Spain usually takes as its starting point the late 1970s. This is when Spain, after a long dictatorship, slowly started to become a democracy, and it's also when people started converting to Islam. A lot of converts were celebrating the end of fascism by exploring new lifestyles of all kinds, alternatives to Catholicism. Some people became interested in Sufism, the mystical branch of Islam, via participation in counterculture communities. And at the same time that conversion to Islam gained traction, Spain was also experiencing a new sort of economic boom as a result of joining the EU. And Andalusia transitioned from being primarily a region that sent immigrants to other places in Europe to being a region that became a destination for migrants, especially from Morocco. And so because of this, scholars often talk about Islam and migration in Spain as though it was this sort of brand new phenomenon. They talk about it as being new compared to places like Germany or France that have this sort of long-standing Muslim question. But through ethnography of these kinds of demographic changes since the 70s, what I've found is that most people in Andalusia understand questions of migration, Islam, and religious pluralism as being shaped by encounters between Spain and Morocco, not since the 1970s, but really since the 700s. So the question of how to interpret Andalusia's more or less 800-year Moorish period is really one of the oldest questions of regional historiography, or the process of history making, and politics. Partly because Andalusia was the longest held Muslim territory of Spain, and Granada the longest piece of that territory. Granada has really come to symbolize the idea of Arab or Muslim Spain. And Muslim heritage figures centrally in positive and negative scholarly and popular definitions of what it means to be a person from the region of Andalusia. So for example, Andalusia is historically one of Spain's poorest and most disenfranchised regions. And stigmatizing narratives of regional backwardness sometimes attribute this situation to the region's Moorish heritage. So people will talk about the semi-Muslim or semi-Moorish character of the people there. At the same time, though, other factors really favor the celebration of Islam in Granada, especially as the basis of the tourism economy, which is an enormous part of the economic health of the city and the region. It's focused on the many Moorish monuments in Granada. Celebrating Islam has also sometimes been the basis for bids for regional political autonomy at various points in time. And it also figures in narratives of city pride. So one of the ethnographic nodes that I've been trying to untangle in my work is how people in Granada engage in everyday historiography. Bless you. And by that, I just mean the way that Granada's non-academic public engages in the same kinds of sort of fierce debates about history telling that have animated scholarship of the region. So to give you some ethnographic examples of this sort of everyday historiography and its diversity, I'll start with what I talk about as being sort of Islamophilia or Islamophilic historical narratives. In other words, narratives that embrace and champion Muslim heritage. So Spanish residents of Granada regularly invoke the Moorish period with me. This often happens in unsolicited comments where people describe Granada as an essentially Muslim and Arab space. So when I was doing research, people would tell me that Granada is the land of convivencia, which translates more or less as coexistence or co-living. And it's the word that people use to refer to the supposedly peaceful coexistence of Muslims, Jews, and Christians in medieval Granada. And many non-Muslims felt that because they had inherited this Muslim past in their city, Granada should be a beacon of interreligious harmony in Europe. And they saw instances of racism as simply failures to understand Granada's history. So for example, in an interview with a non-Muslim woman who was sort of railing against racism in the city, she said, well, Granada has been al-Andalus, and al-Andalus, for those that don't know, is just the Arabic name for medieval Muslim Iberia. So she said, Granada has been al-Andalus. I mean to say that it's Muslim land, so there shouldn't be racism here. And this kind of quote is something I heard a lot. Some people actually went so far as to say not only that racism shouldn't exist in Granada, but that it didn't and really couldn't. that Granada was kind of a fundamentally non-racist space. So Mamin, an Andalusian social worker who provided NGO services to immigrants looking for jobs, insisted to me in an interview that historically, Granada was the last Muslim kingdom, you know? A lot of that culture and tradition has been conserved, and I think this helps. I think Andalusia has to be different from the north because of this, right? Simply because of the culture, history, being right next to the Mediterranean, the passing of civilizations and cultures. Yes, Moroccans, for example, in Andalusia, they're much more at ease. I'm telling you, they feel much more comfortable here. So there are many things we could talk about from this quote, but what I want to comment on is how these comments reflect an assumption that's common to many forms of liberal multiculturalism, which is just the idea that proximity and contact between groups lead not only to influence or familiarity, but also to a kind of affinity. So she's referring to the idea of a historically rooted intercultural friendship between cultures on northern and southern Mediterranean shores. And at first glance, this seems like a very happy comment, right, and a very kind of inclusive gesture on her part. She's celebrating Andalusia's Muslim past as something positive for the present. But at the same time, she really persistently refused to recognize racism and discrimination toward Muslims as a problem in Granada, and her job was to help Muslim migrants find jobs and navigate life in the city. And so this kind of discursive denial of racism was really consequential because of her position helping people. She didn't see racism as something to take into account or to try and address in her position. So this is just one, I think, very small example of something I see all the time in my work, which is that historical narratives about Muslim Granada matter for the present, and also that it's not just that there are positive and negative ways of talking about the Muslim past, but that even seemingly inclusive narratives like Mamin's can actually entail exclusionary social consequences. So now I'm going to switch gears and talk a little bit about Muslims' historical narratives of return and belonging. So my Moroccan research participants often consider themselves to be descendants of the city of Granada's medieval Muslims, and they often talk about their arrival in Spain less as a migration and more as a kind of diasporic return to a long-lost homeland. And in their narratives of return, Moroccans constructed their presence in Granada as logical, legitimate, and often as a moral corrective to their ancestors' expulsion during the Inquisition. And migrant research participants would do things like point out to me all of the Arabic-derived place names in Granada. People would take me on tours of streets and businesses with names beginning in al, which usually denotes an Arabic root for a Spanish word. They would also point out the city's medieval-built Muslim quarter, which is pretty large and is now home to kind of the nucleus of the Moorish-themed tourism industry. But the neighborhood also has halal food, tea houses, and souvenir shops. And when they're talking about this history and the neighborhood, Moroccans often emphasize the continuity between Granada's medieval and present-day Muslims in linguistic constructions that collapse the two periods. So one man who was walking me through this neighborhood said about the Albaicin, my great-great-great-great-great, etc. grandparents built this. And another said, this looks just like Morocco because we were here before. So it's interesting to think about how this kind of language, the word we in that sentence, if there are any linguistic anthropologists in the room, that we really collapses time, right? It implies kind of a shared identity category or a category of experience between modern Moroccans and those who built, the Albaicin centuries ago. Alongside migrants, convert Muslims also draw on Moorish history to claim Muslim space in the city. But they do so in really different ways using different kinds of themes. So rather than emphasizing, say, their ancestors' contributions to the built landscape of the city, converts tend to emphasize ways that their Islamic practice and their ways of living mirror and revive lauded civilizational sensibilities that are widely associated with medieval Iberia. So they'll talk about things like a cosmopolitan approach to cultural difference, involvement in international trade, which they see as kind of a way of reviving the internationalism of al-Andalus, or even participation in flamenco, which is a music and dance genre that is thought to contain Arab and Muslim roots, but also happens to be kind of a quintessential marker of authentic Andalusian culture in Spain. So I won't go into that too much. I'll just leave it at that for now. But a lot of my work has focused on how inequality conditions the way convert and migrant Muslims have access to and the different ways that they activate historical memory in their claims of belonging in the city. So overall, converts' claims of belonging align them with really widely celebrated artistic and cultural sensibilities that the wider public associates positively with Islamic heritage in Spain. On the other hand, migrants' claims of belonging that are through this sort of discourse of a prior presence in Iberia, these are more likely to get slotted into public discourses about racial difference and territorial invasion. So these are really different ways of being able to kind of harness that historical memory to claim belonging in the city. And in fact, in general, Muslims' potential to claim belonging based on Moorish history is really a source of great anxiety for some non-Muslims in the city. So this is really clear in non-Muslim research participants' Islamophobic or anti-Muslim historical narratives. So anti-Muslim sentiment in Granada is very complex and draws usually on kind of pan-European discourses that cast Islam as being an obstacle to European modernity, secularism, democracy, security, gender equality. The list goes on in terms of the way that Islam is talked about as a problem for Europe. But in Granada, anti-Muslim sentiment also really reflects highly local concerns about the return of the Moors, or Moros, which is the sort of pejorative term people use to talk about Muslims and Moroccans. So Muslims, especially migrants, are routinely ranked lowest on opinion polls about attitudes toward minorities. And anti-Muslim sentiment really skyrocketed after 2004 when the Madrid train bombings happened and they were attributed to al-Qaeda. Non-Muslim research participants have not infrequently pulled me aside to talk in hushed tones about al-Qaeda operatives who have threatened to retake al-Andalus for the Muslim world. And anti-migrant graffiti in Granada often includes words like re-invasion or retaking. Sometimes Muslims' claims of return and belonging and non-Muslims' anxiety about such claims clash directly, as in the following exchange. So one afternoon, Olivia, one of my research participants, who was a Spanish woman who really frequently talked about herself as liberal, tolerant, welcoming, was talking about the Albaicin quarter, this old Moorish quarter. And she said she went there once to a tea house and she was never going back. And I asked her why, and she recounted an altercation between she and her friends and some Moroccan waiters at this tea house. So apparently what happened is one of Olivia's friends had ordered té moro, or Moor tea, basically, using the pejorative term moro, instead of ordering Moroccan tea, which is what mint tea is listed as on menus in this neighborhood. So the Moroccan waiters got angry and basically told her group that they were rude and inappropriate, that they shouldn't be using this kind of slur. And according to Olivia, the Moroccan waiter started going on and on about how Andalusia is really Muslim, really Moroccan territory, and that the Moors are the original and authentic inhabitants, that Andalusia isn't really Spain, it's really Africa because it used to be Muslim. They were saying such crazy things, such stupid, ridiculous things. They're from another world telling us that this is their territory, that we're the ones who aren't in our territory, when in reality, they're the ones in a foreign country. So because I wasn't present for this altercation, right, she's recounting it to me after the fact, I can't know exactly how accurately Olivia described these quote-unquote ridiculous things that the waiter said to her. But what I think is clear from her retelling of the story is that these Moroccan waiters were articulating claims of belonging in Andalusia in terms of those same kinds of historical tropes and reference that underlie the tourist industry in this neighborhood. So tourists are, invited to come to this neighborhood to experience a slice of exotic Morocco on Spanish soil. And the claims that these waiters made, or her paraphrasing of them, seem to recall the non-Muslim Spanish woman that I quoted earlier who referred to Granada as being Muslim land, right? But in the context of claims for Moroccan authenticity and belonging, Olivia found this waiter to be totally outlandish and offensive. And I think perhaps this is because his claims rang a little bit true to her, or at least echoed kind of a sense of this propensity for reinvasion. They evoked this anxiety that she shares with other non-Muslims about this sort of reinvasion possibility. So now that I've talked about some of the competing narratives of Muslim history that circulate in people's everyday historiography in Granada, I'm going to move on to talking about some of their social and political consequences, and I'll focus on how they produce tensions among converts and migrants, particularly around the issues of representation and religious authority in the city. So we have this context of competing ways of talking about the Muslim past. And in this milieu, Muslims are constantly trying to represent Islam to wider publics in Granada. And it's important to think about how these sort of twin, what I think of as Islamophobic and Islamophilic sort of inclinations, or we could call them inclusive and exclusive discourses, these intermingle in Granada, and they also affect different groups differently. So converts and immigrants are not equally discriminated against by anti-Muslim sectors. For instance, Moroccans are more readily slotted into this dangerous Moro category. They're more visible as racial, religious, and national outsiders. Their physical appearance, accented Spanish, and their structural labor marginalization all kind of mark them in more permanent ways and more publicly inescapable ways. In contrast, converts were far less likely to experience things like financial hardship, housing shortages, legal problems due to discrimination. They don't have the same kinds of social markers that make immigrant Muslims automatically visible. And because of that, there is the issue that some non-Muslims envision converts as a kind of sleeper cell that can take over Spain and Europe all the more easily because they're hidden. This is something people have found in research on converts in other parts of Europe too. So this leads to some exclusionary fears of converts as traitors. But in practice, on a daily basis, converts' ability not to be automatically recognized as Muslims actually allows them to sort of avoid racializing recognition in public. So most convert men are pretty much undetectable as Muslims in routine public interactions. And a lot of convert women wear a style of headscarves that resembles trendy scarves worn by hippies or hippies in Spain, rather than obviously Muslim garments. So, as I mentioned before, converts have had more luck than migrants in tapping into nostalgic or Islamophilic memories of medieval Spanish Islam, and because of all of these other sort of ways that they are better or more successfully incorporated, they also own many businesses in the now touristy historic Moorish quarter. And inequality also conditions converts and migrants' experiences of minority representation, as well as their widespread sense of responsibility for representing Islam to wider publics in the first place, which is a kind of a burden of representation that most Muslims experience when they're minorities in Western spaces, right? So two really brief examples demonstrate the uneven ways that this happens for convert and migrant Muslims. So these two examples are the way that convert Muslims use a public-oriented mosque to represent themselves to the wider community, and an individual Moroccan woman's experience of being called upon by a total stranger to explain Islam. So first I'll talk about this mosque. Have any of you been to Granada? Oh, wow, lots. Okay, so you may have walked by this mosque. But so this is the Mezquita Mayor de Granada, which is a beautiful whitewashed mosque high in the hills of this touristy Albaicin neighborhood. It opened in 2003. It was opened by converts, and it has a stunning view of the Alhambra, which is this sort of famous Moorish palace, and it's right across a narrow valley from the mosque. This mosque is the most publicly recognized mosque in Granada, and it's the one that non-Muslims are most likely to encounter because of its location in this touristy zone. The general public can come into the mosque, they can meander the grounds, they can walk through the patio. There's these beautiful gardens overlooking the Alhambra. You can take organized tours, you can buy souvenirs, you can buy baked goods. On most days, convert women are having a bake sale outside, especially before Friday prayers. And this openness is complex. It results in part from converts' commitment to Islamic dawah, which here they understand primarily meaning the spreading of Islam to new converts. So they aim to create this kind of welcoming and informative environment in order to do that. But their outreach is also conditioned by their sense that Islam has a negative public image problem in Spain, and they really want to remedy that. And these sort of efforts at a representational rehabilitation of Islam through their open mosque was really clear to me when one Friday after the sermon, a convert friend kind of startled me by saying, "See, Micaela, you might think that in the mosque they talk about terrorism or, fanatical stuff. But see, it's just about, be virtuous and nothing more." And of course, my research doesn't deal with terrorism. I never ask anyone about terrorism. And yet it's a topic that people broach to say, hey, did you notice how terrorism wasn't the subject of our Friday sermon, right? So I think, comments like this reflect a degree of vigilance about how outsiders are perceiving Islam. And the mosque is sort of the main way that converts try and combat what they see as a negative image. Muslim immigrants, on the other hand, also experience this sort of strong imperative to display and explain and defend Islam. But they don't share converts' theological goal to convert people to Islam, and they don't have the institutionalized means of representation that come along with a well-funded mosque, for example. Instead, when Muslim migrants talk to me about their efforts to represent Islam, they're usually talking about experiences that they have as individuals in public settings. And these kinds of encounters are kind of constant in daily life, often gendered, and very anxiety-producing. So Hannah, who's a woman who had lived in Spain for nearly 20 years when I met her, still feared these kinds of situations when she went out in public. She told me that since she'd begun wearing a headscarf 5 years ago, she was more often approached by strangers who would ask her about Islam. One afternoon, following a public talk about the Israel-Palestine conflict, Hannah told me that a woman near her in the audience, quote, took advantage of the fact that I'm a Muslim to ask me about Islam. She asked me if it was true that in the Quran it says a man is allowed to hit a woman. Hannah recalled that she had hesitated before answering that as far as she knew, the Quran did give that permission, but that one also had to take into account various interpretations of the Quran and the fact that just because violence might be textually permitted doesn't mean that it happens in real life. And as she was telling me this story, she really agonized at length about whether her response had been accurate and whether it might have reflected poorly on her or on other Muslims in the eyes of this group of Spaniards who had been listening. And her experience, I think, illustrates both the difference between the way converts end up representing Islam in public and migrants, and it also really shows how headscarves have become such a strong signifier of Muslim difference that non-Muslim people often feel comfortable coming up to women in headscarves and asking them to explain and, defend all manner of things that they think might be related to Islam. And this creates kind of a constant source of stress for Muslim women, especially migrant women, in public spaces. And in fact, Hannah's story is pretty mild as far as these things go. So the research participants have told me about and I've witnessed more violent versions of this kind of encounter, cases where Muslim women get threatened in public or where people even try and like rip off their headscarves. So how then do these different experiences of minority representation and status and different concerns about representation, how do these issues influence relationships between converts and migrants in the Muslim community? That's sort of our next question. And the answer is that they produce tensions. So just like Spaniards have these ambivalent attitudes about Moorish history and about Islam in their city, converts and migrants also express a lot of ambivalence about one another. So Moroccans that I work with range from people who celebrate conversion as a quasi-miracle. They're astounded to find that there are Europeans adopting their religion, to people who disparage converts as religious imposters and racists. A lot of Moroccans initially see converts as sort of natural social allies, and they see converts and think, oh, this is a group of people who will accept me because they're accepting Islam in Europe. And so they're sometimes even more surprised and more upset about rejection from converts than they are from, say, Catholic or secular Spaniards. A lot of Moroccan stories that explain why they sort of don't get along well with converts or why they're wary of converts actually involve the mosque that I was just talking about. So a young woman named Rana, who was speaking about convert women at the mosque, explained they have different practices, ones that make you feel uncomfortable, like they wear makeup and strong perfume and a different kind of headscarf. You just don't feel at ease praying there. They wear those kinds of headscarves to avoid scaring people so much. So this woman, Rana, she really loved the Moorish architecture of the mosque because it reminded her of home, and so when it first opened, she tried to go there. But she actually no longer prayed there by the time I met her, because of these criticisms. And her criticisms reflect really a melding of religious, representational, and political concerns about converts. Many Moroccans resented the fact that converts focused on spreading Islam, while migrants struggled with problems like discrimination, police violence, restrictive immigration laws. And for Rana, she really felt she couldn't share convert women's efforts to, as she put it, avoid scaring people so much. And this was in part because the convert-style headscarves and some of the other practices at the mosque violated Rana's convictions about proper ways of being embodying Islamic womanhood. But it was also because Moroccan women have this more sort of rigid racialization process that means they don't have converts' ability to sometimes pass as members of the non-Muslim majority, and there's a lot of sort of resentment and tension around that fact. Other Moroccans that I worked with critiqued converts from the opposite direction. So rather than calling them lax about religious precepts and practices, they thought converts were overly fanatical. So one day I was sitting with Mohammed, a Moroccan in his mid-20s, at the Arab-themed tourist souvenir store where he worked. And I asked if he knew many converts to Islam. And he said, oh yeah, a lot of them. And he kind of waved his arm toward the street, alluding to all of the convert-owned shops in the area. And then he frowned and kind of leaned in and whispered, but the truth is, I don't like most of them. And to illustrate why, he shared a story about converts being overly strict. So one evening at dusk, Mohammed and a friend of his had gone up to this convert mosque to check it out. And they saw lots of converts behind the shut gate. They were kind of milling around the patio, looking at the Alhambra, enjoying the evening. And a convert man came over to the gate, but refused to open it for them. And Mohammed said he explained to the guy, oh, hi, we're Muslims and, we want to check out your beautiful mosque. And the man replied to him that visiting hours were over, that they could come in if they wanted to pray, but they couldn't come in just to look at the patio and walk around. And Mohammed was furious about this, and trying to convey to me how angry he was and why, he nearly shouted, they wouldn't let me in to a mosque, which to me as a Muslim is a sacred place. I felt rejected, and by other Muslims. And he was sort of horrified that they had stuck to their, visiting hours rules and denied him entry. And he really thought that he was denied entry because he was a Moroccan and not a member of the convert Muslim community. So just as Moroccans were concerned about converts' religious practices and their portrayals of Islam, converts were also skeptical of Muslims' practices. So I'll talk for a minute about converts' sort of ambivalence toward Moroccans. So convert Muslims in Granada, by and large, create new Muslim identities in relation to really ambivalent notions of Moroccanness. So some people place Moroccans on a pedestal as kind of authentic Muslim role models, people that they can look to as examples for how to be a good Muslim person. But some of them also disparage Moroccans as racial and ethnic others who misunderstand Islam or don't practice the right kind of Islam. I first visited the apartment of a woman named Belen, who was a Spanish lawyer in her early 30s, shortly after she had converted to Islam. Showing me around her place, Belen proudly showed me her Moroccan tea set and the cushions that she had arranged to emulate a Middle Eastern living room. And she said, "Now that I'm Muslim and living with an Arab man as his wife, I always try to have snacks around and make tea whenever anyone comes over, because it's very important to Muslims to be hospitable." So this notion of Arab or Muslim hospitality is a really widespread stereotype in Spain, and Belen had kind of picked up on it and incorporated it into her life as a way of becoming a new Muslim person. And I heard similar comments from many convert women, including women who weren't, married to an Arab Muslim. So it seemed that Moroccan-style clothing, Moroccan foods, making tea were ways that women sort of worked to fashion new Muslim selfhoods in very tangible ways. And these came from the examples of Morocco that they sort of had in their imaginations. But other convert women explicitly rejected these kinds of practices. And as one woman put it, quote, "Dressing up as Arabs was counterproductive to the goal of establishing a European Islam and making Islam accepted in Granada." In the words of Farida, who was a young convert woman, "Lots of people confuse me with Moroccans. And once they think I'm a Moroccan, then they think, oh, stupid. They think I can barely read and write. And this really bothers me. Because, the fact that I wear a headscarf doesn't have anything to do with being Moroccan. And besides, the Moroccans, maybe they're a little lacking in the intellect department, but they're still people, and they work really hard." So I think that converts' desire to emphasize that being Muslim need not be linked to a particular ethnicity or nationality. I think this was meant, this is the charitable interpretation, I think she meant this as kind of an anti-essentialist argument about religion, right? But obviously with some deeply troubling elements. And this kind of approach was further apparent in other converts' insistence that they practiced a pure Islam that was untainted by culture or tradition, which is a really common discourse among my convert research participants. So a British convert, for example, when she was comparing immigrant and convert religiosity, said, "Migrants really bring their own culture and traditions, so it's not really Islam, We like it here," referring to the convert mosque, "because it's not culture or tradition, it's the purest Islam." So this woman's convert peers also echoed her sentiment again and again, constantly comparing what they saw as their own European and acultural Islam to the quote-unquote traditions of Moroccan immigrants, and they talked in the same way about other Muslim migrants in Granada. So what ends up happening here is that by mapping cultural contamination or tradition onto migrants and claiming this sort of pure, culture-free Islam as their own, converts end up constructing European as this sort of normal, unmarked social category, and everything that's different is bad and problematic in some way. And so their critique of Moroccans ultimately ends up being not just about religious practice or religious authority, but it also ends up becoming a discourse about racial and cultural value and ideas of European superiority overall. And this ends up really impeding solidarity among Muslims in Granada. And ultimately, this goes beyond attitudes. So it's not just things people say about one another behind closed doors, but it also ends up making it difficult when Muslims from the convert community and the migrant community try to get together to cooperate on, movements for more political rights or more social inclusion. So, to conclude, I think southern Spain is interesting because it gives us this nice sort of unique window into questions about contemporary Muslim life in urban Europe, because it's a place where you have fear and hatred of Muslims coexisting with openness to and interest in Islam, and all of this is based on kind of different interpretations of a trans-regional past. So this ambivalence stems from this long history of entanglement between North Africa and Europe, and the complex ways that it's helped shape the politics of identity in Spain. And in Granada, you have apprehension and excitement about Islam, and these things contribute to Muslim visibility and to the sort of compulsion for Muslims to represent themselves in their religion. But European converts and migrant Muslims, different experiences of these burdens of minority representation create these tensions. And the tensions between them end up kind of reinscribing racial and cultural hierarchies. And so ultimately, because of this, we can't really look at Spain and say, okay, here's another example of a kind of blanket European Islamophobia. And we also can't say, okay, here's an example of European Islamophilia that's an antidote to European exclusion, because both of these perspectives flatten the complexity of what's going on. And I think that these historical narratives and representational politics have some helpful implications for thinking about trans-regional connections at the margins of area studies, regions like the MENA and Europe. So first, thinking about this long historical entanglement between North Africa and Europe can help us think in new ways about migration, diaspora, and religious minorities, in part by highlighting the instability of some of the categories that are very common in migration scholarship. So we have these long-term historical narratives that reconfigure a process that might otherwise be called migration as a return, and really upend easy conceptual distinctions between homelands and hostlands, the social roles of host and guest, and the supposedly unidirectional nature of migrant mobility, right? So we have people in Granada who are imagining Spain and Morocco as this semi-contiguous space of long-term back and forth movement, and I think that to really get at that, it helps to think trans-regionally in terms of not just the spatial dimensions of mobility, but also the historical dimensions. And then second, focusing on how historical memory of these trans-regional entanglements shapes social life differently for different groups is important. So the trans-regional connections between Spain and Morocco don't have a sort of uniform, natural way of unfolding in social life. They affect convert and migrant Muslims differently. So these groups differently access the Moorish past in their claims of belonging. They have different risks of being associated with the Moorish past in negative ways. And more broadly, looking at conversion and migration together in a trans-regional context, I think, helps us see how limiting some of our language for talking about Islam in Europe has been. So common ways of talking about European multiculturalism tend to automatically separate migrants and non-migrants or Muslims from Europeans, and that really doesn't do justice to the way multiculturalism works, certainly not in Granada, where you have really complex kinds of identifications. So, for example, Andalusia's Islamophilic historical memory and European conversion movements suggest much more coincidence between the categories European and Muslim, right? We have Europeans who are Muslim, who are becoming Muslims, and even non-Muslim Andalusians will sometimes talk about how they're kind of Muslim or a little bit Muslim, right, because of their Muslim heritage. And then in the other direction, my research findings really suggest far less coincidence of political identifications and religious subjectivities within categories like European and Muslim, right? So you have tensions between different kinds of Muslims, and you have Europeans radically disagreeing about the place of Islam in their own history and their own identity. So I'm looking at the clock, and I think it is time to wrap up. So these are some trans-regional considerations, some food for thought for those of you in the class to keep thinking about, thinking critically about kind of where the MENA region begins and ends, both historically and in the contemporary period. Thanks.
Could you give us a little more history on conversion?
Yeah.
Frankly, I was not really aware. I've been to Spain several times, just when I've come across it. I've been even on it, but never met too many Muslims. So, I think that, does it begin not long after 1492, or is it something more recently?
Oh, you mean long history? Yeah. Well, sometimes when people talk about religion in Spain, they'll say, you know, the first thing we have to talk about is conversion, because the history of religion in Spain has been not just contact between Jews, Muslims, and Christians, but also constant waves of conversion back and forth, sometimes voluntary, sometimes coerced, right? And I will be the first to say I am not a historian of the medieval period. I just do research on how people talk about that period today. So I can't give you a ton of information about the long history of Muslim conversion. The converts that I work with are really a varied group. So a lot of them are part of the global Murabitun community, which is a Sufi group that really began to attract converts in the 60s. And the Murabitun converts in Spain are part of actually a global process where you had in the 60s a lot of people who were involved in kind of radical 60s politics, counterculture movements, who became interested in Sufism, sometimes through interest in music or artistic practices, lots of different routes. But the older converts in Granada, a lot of them are from that period, that group. But people continue to convert constantly. So the mosque that I showed pictures of, you know, most, I don't want to say weeks, but at least most months, there would be people who would come to the mosque expressing interest in Islam, and then like a few Fridays later, they would actually say the Shahada, which is the profession of faith, and convert. And one of the things I really try and emphasize in my writing about conversion is that there's a tendency sometimes to want to explain conversion, what kind of person converts, or what is the sociological, sort of the ultimate sociological explanation for these people. And what I found is that it just really depends. It's incredibly diverse. So people convert for all kinds of reasons. Sometimes they undergo some kind of personal trauma that leads to a reevaluation of their spirituality. Sometimes there are people who have been thinking about religion and spirituality their entire life and trying out lots of things, and they end up finding Islam to be the best for them. Sometimes it's through a partner. Sometimes people tell me conversion narratives that are all about the city of Granada. So they'll talk about how they were just taken in by the romance of the Moorish architecture and the sort of feeling of the city, and it sort of swept them up and brought them to Islam. So people are from all different kinds of socioeconomic backgrounds. So they're really, I resist the idea of there being kind of like a profile of what a convert looks like or why people convert. It's very diverse. Does that answer your question somewhat?
Would you say there's been more conversion since the fall of Franco?
Yes.
Probably not a lot, right?
No. Yeah. So the Murabitun group that began in the 60s was a global movement, but it took root in Spain as the Franco dictatorship was ending. And it was, you know, a lot of converts will talk about that period in particular as being, the conversion movement was one node in what people refer to as the movida, which is like a period of, you know, expansion of all different kinds of alternative lifestyles, and Islam being one way of experimenting with new stuff. Yeah.
Thanks for your fine presentation. So far, you've very appropriately spoken as a gentlewoman and a scholar, if I can use that term. I have a couple of questions more as an individual. One, if I heard you right, you said you are a Muslim yourself.
No.
Oh, I didn't hear you. Okay.
Sorry.
Forget that
No.
first one.
Okay.
The second question is, reading the American quality press, which pretty much comes down to the New York Times, the impression one has is that anti-Muslim sentiment has been much less of a problem in Spain than in other countries, particularly France and Germany. And do you agree with that? First of all, just impressionistically, I know you're not an expert in all of Europe. If you do, is it because there are fewer Muslims? Is it because the Muslims have been beaten down historically by the Reconquista and by the Inquisition and by the Spanish conquest of Morocco, perhaps? Or also it could be true because they're more acculturated? Or other possibilities might be that there's a certain Spanish pride in the Muslim heritage. I mean, in southern Spain, all the major tourist attractions are all, very Moorish influenced, really, Granada above all.
Yeah. Well, the answer is yes and no. I mean, so what you're referring to is, yes, there's this idea, people even will refer to it sometimes as the Iberian model, the idea that both Spain and Portugal basically are kinder to immigrants in general and religious diversity, but specifically in conversations about Islam. And what I found is that I don't really buy that idea of an Iberian model. I understand where it comes from, in part because, in Granada, for example, you have this amazing tourism sector that's all about Moorish history, and there are, I won't go into it in detail, but there are a lot of historical moments that have contributed to the sort of celebration of Islam in southern Spain in general. But that historical sort of obsession or focus on Moorish history produces just as much anti-Muslim sentiment. So I really think both are there all the time. It's not a case of I don't think that Spain or Portugal are ultimately more hospitable to Muslims. Part of the other part of that sort of story of the Iberian model is comes from political analysis and looking at how Spain and Portugal have sort of more Muslims and migrants have more access to the welfare state there than they do in other parts of Europe. And there also hasn't been this sort of rise of successful, publicly visible anti-Muslim sort of radical right-wing parties that there has been elsewhere in Europe. So if you look at kind of a macro scale, it really can seem like, okay, things are better there. And it's not that those things don't matter, but the kind of ethnography I do is really focused less on these sort of official politics and more on sort of the micro scale of everyday interaction. And there I find that it's sort of this constant mix of excitement about Islam, welcoming attitudes, and totally terrified hatred of Muslims. Did you have a question? I think there was a hand over here. Yeah.
I have a question. So I'm just wondering, we're talking a lot about the tensions between the converts and the migrants.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm wondering, are there any points of solidarity or collaboration with them, let's say, in protest against Islamophobia or helping refugees?
Yeah. Not in either of the areas that you mentioned, but there is one point of solidarity, which is in mobilizations around Israel-Palestine. So in marches for Palestinian rights. But there is, you also see solidarity there across sort of like most of the Spanish population, because Palestinian rights is a hugely popular issue in Spain. So that's kind of the one time when you will see in the street, Catholic and secular people and Muslim converts and migrants. There's one day in Spain where there are a lot of public Catholic-based holidays in Granada, like around Easter week, for example, where people wear outfits that are derived from the Inquisition. and so Muslims all kind of agree that they don't like that holiday. There's a day called the Day of the Retaking, basically, on January 2nd, that celebrates and actually reenacts the Catholic conquest of the city of Granada. And that holiday sometimes brings small groups of like neo-fascists into town, and so that's a day also where you find some solidarity between converts and migrants trying to talk about like ways to stay safe. But other than that, not so much.
Yeah, so thank you very much. This is very rich. And one observation and one question. The observation is that actually, last I knew, unless things have changed a lot, the Spanish don't have many Muslims compared to their population and compared to the rest of Europe. The statistic that stuck in my mind was roughly 40 million Spaniards, 250,000 immigrant Muslims. Again, this is maybe an old statistic by now, but it's not like France or Germany or Britain. It actually is closest to Denmark in that regard. So that might help to explain why there's not a Pegida or an anti-Muslim party, because it's just not big enough Muslim working class to be positioned in that way. But then the question is that you mentioned about the Mohabbatun and the Sufi converts and so forth, and the tensions that you mentioned between the immigrant Moroccan and I presume Pakistani and other Muslims and the converts. You mentioned lifestyle issues, but surely for the converts, Ibn Arabi and the Andalusian Sufi tradition both large, whereas at least some of the immigrants will be more Salafi-minded, and they might be, in Morocco they would have voted for Quran and be more, we might say, fundamentalist. Does that kind, you didn't mention very much of these sort of ideological potential conflicts there.
Well, one of the things that I find really interesting is that, I mean, Sufism obviously has a long and widespread presence in Morocco. And so I was often surprised when, perhaps naively, when Moroccan research participants would say, oh, those Sufi weirdos, what are they doing? And I was like, wait, aren't you used to being around Sufism? So the Mohabbatun globally and in Granada, and I will preface this by saying that not all of the convert community is Mohabbatun, but they have a very strong kind of public presence. They're somewhat of a controversial group. So some people have accused them of being anti-Semitic conspiracy theorists. Other people see them as the kind of most moderate branch of Islam in Europe. So there's a really wide-ranging way of talking about them. But so some of the tension around religious authority and politics, I think, stems from that. Because, so if I talk to converts about Moroccans, they'll talk about how, oh, it's such a shame that everyone thinks that we're fundamentalists and extremists because of these Muslim immigrants. And immigrants will say, oh, those Mohabbatun, they're constantly saying inflammatory things in the media, and they have this very sort of Salafi ideology, which they may or may not, right? It's a very diverse group. But so it's actually migrants usually complaining about converts as being more likely to have Salafist tendencies or leanings. And so they're constantly worried that converts will create an image of Muslims in Spain that bolsters people's ideas of, their sort of fears of radicalism. And then they worry that they, as migrant Muslims, will suffer the consequences of that. So that is really the main way that ideology comes into play. People don't talk very much about theology. Like, they'll reference theology and say, oh, they do things wrong, or I don't quite like their practice. But usually it kind of comes down to the kinds of discussions I've just been talking about. And I mean, a lot of my research is with, excuse me, with women, and the debates about what kind of headscarves are appropriate to wear, and the political consequences of different kinds of headscarves. That is probably the number one thing that comes up. Yeah.
You mentioned some strong division in terms of attitudes and practices between the converts and the immigrants. And so my question for you is, where do Muslim converts who convert because they have an immigrant partner fit into this? And is that just a very, very small percentage?
I don't know statistically across Spain what percentage of people convert because of a partner, but among my research participants, it is a small group. Yeah.
And I assume they didn't have these attitudes that they were better than the immigrants.
Well, sometimes people do. I mean, it's interesting, right? Like, humans are fascinatingly complex, right? And people can harbor sort of broad ideologies about a community despite having a partner from that community, it turns out. But yeah, I mean, people who converted after meeting a partner, for example, were often more open to diversity of ethnic groups within Islam, for example. Although there are also cases where people who married converts end up being sort of pulled into the convert community and separated a bit from their ethnic community. The word convert in Spain is a funny term because it's used really as kind of an ethnic and class marker in Granada as much as a religious term. So the convert community is not just people who were born Catholic or some other religion and then adopted Islam. It's also people who are married to those people, or sometimes it includes people who were born Muslim in a northern European country and then came to Granada because of its Muslim history. So convert ends up referring to people who are considered upper class and white, basically, and migrant ends up referring to everybody else. So convert often refers to people who actually converted to Islam, but it's also this kind of social marker as well. So yeah, the group of people that I worked with that were converts who married a born Muslim was a smaller group, and some of those people were more open to the idea that Islam can look many ways, but some of them weren't. Does that sort of answer your question? Okay. Yeah.
In your work, have you ever come across anything in terms of how either converts or Moroccans talk about other Muslims in the community, for example, like sub-Saharan African Muslims in the community and what their sentiment is towards them, or like use of the mosque?
Yeah, so much less of my work has been with sub-Saharan African migrants, some of whom are also Muslim. So generally speaking, North African Muslims are much more aware of the existence of those people as Muslim. Sometimes converts don't even know that sub-Saharan Africans in Spain might be Muslim. They assume that they're either Christian or that they practice indigenous African religions. They're sometimes surprised to find that, oh, this entire community of Senegalese people are Muslim. The mosques are pretty divided. So Senegalese migrants, for example, don't go mostly to the same mosques as converts or Moroccan migrants. Although my sense is that that's actually changing a little bit. A bunch of my research was at a migrant rights organization that was constantly trying to get different groups of migrants together, and constantly failing. Like, just month after month, there would be a meeting with leaders from different communities coming together and having similar goals, but for a variety of reasons, there was never a kind of lasting, sustainable relationship being forged. I don't think that's necessarily always going to be the case. I think it partly has to do with different labor activities, different kinds of seasonal migration going on in different communities, but there's more separation than there is coming together. sometimes. I mean, there's a long history in Morocco and other parts of North Africa of, racism toward sub-Saharan Africans for sure. And I think some of that affects the way that Moroccans in Grenada think about other migrants from Africa. It's also the case that so Spanish ideologies about different kinds of ethnic or racial groups tend to sort of attribute different characteristics to different groups. So when people talk about African migrants, they talk about them in really different ways than they talk about Moroccans. So Moroccans are more talked about as there's sort of more of a criminality aspect to discourses about Moroccans, and there's lots and lots of racism toward African migrants, but it tends to be more sort of infantilizing. There's this ideology that Africans are refugees who need to be saved, and Moroccans are criminals who are going to retake Spain for al-Qaeda or something. So, so that I think might play into also some of the relationships between North and Sub-Saharan Africans.
So Spain has become very much secular after Franco. How secularization plays in the kinds of this Islamic renaissance in Ghana?
Well, it's really interesting because I think one of the differences I see in the study of Islam in Spain versus in, say, France or the UK or Germany is that public discussions of secularism there are really different. People don't necessarily talk about Islam as a unique threat to secularism. They more talk about secularism as something that they kind of don't successfully have anyway. Which is not, I mean, you're right that Spain has become a much more secularized place since Franco. But in terms of people's sort of self-understanding, I found that a lot of people will say, oh, well, we're not secular enough anyway because we're still kind of too Catholic. And so there's a way in which sometimes people see Muslims as sort of fellow people who are also not secular enough for the rest of Europe. But also sometimes people see the growing Muslim population as a threat to the process of secularization that they've been working so hard at. But it also kind of creates points of solidarity sometimes between Muslims and non-Muslims. So really devout Catholic people in Grenada sometimes get along really well with Muslim people who they otherwise would have conflicts with, but they sort of come together to say we're all people who believe strongly that religion has a place in public life, and we're all being marginalized by this sort of increasingly secularized sensibility. There was a period of my research where there were these buses going around town with slogans that said, God does not exist, enjoy your life, or something along those lines. And it was a time when a lot of my Muslim research participants were like, oh yeah, I was talking to my Catholic neighbors and they were really mad about that too. So the anxieties about becoming secular and what that means sometimes create these sort of points of coming together among Catholics and Muslims. Yeah?
How does Muslim community these days in Grenada fit in the political landscape? Like I was thinking, do they support Podemos or like?
Yeah, that's a great question. Well, the true answer is I did not do field work this past summer, so I don't know. I mean, I don't know how they're feeling about the fact that, so the reference to Podemos, for those of you who don't work in Spain, Spain has not had a functioning government since December of 2015, in part because as a result of the ongoing economic crisis, there have been these new parties, one a kind of center-right-ish party and one a really left-wing party, and there's no coalition government, and they keep trying over and over and failing. So yeah, I don't know. I don't know how the entrance of Podemos has changed things, but generally speaking, my Muslim research participants, converts and migrants, if they are able to vote PSOE. So they're already voting for the Socialist Party. So my guess is that some of them are probably going further left with the option of Podemos, but I don't know to what extent.
Not a fair question, but other than evil
Okay.
I'm very interested to know how general or specific the references to the Convivencia and medieval Spain is, given that over 700 years you also have different invasions happening and shifts in the landscape that have to do with the role of North Africa in the Middle Ages as well.
Yeah.
And of course you have then also a distinction between sort of the Berber factions and what's happening, the folks who are coming out of the Middle East specifically. So to what extent, I mean, is that too nuanced for a public discourse, or do you see particular moments being highlighted as something that can be embraced, that Umayyad dynasty can be embraced, but then what happens later is more problematic, or is that specific for a general population?
Mostly too specific. Every once in a while, someone who just has a lot of educational background about the medieval period will, talk about Umayyads versus Almoravids or something. But generally speaking, it's referred to as the past, our past, or when Muslims were here before. It does range. Like I met several converts who converted to Islam after doing research on the medieval period as master's students and became really enamored with Muslim history, and that drew them down a spiritual path toward Islam too. So it's not like people don't know, but generally speaking, people talk in broad strokes, and they'll talk about, knowing that there were times when things were peaceful and times when things were less peaceful. Sometimes people will talk about specific periods in relation to specific places. So like there's a big public square near the cathedral in Granada where supposedly Arabic texts were burned during the Inquisition, and so people will talk about that if we're having tea near there, for example. But mostly people are talking in really broad strokes. Andrew.
Yes. What is citizenship law in relation to Moroccan immigrants, migrants? How many Muslims, I imagine that the Euro Muslims could be any mix of background and have different citizenship or nationality status, but how easily can a Moroccan become a Spaniard in terms of law and citizenship?
Not very easily. And I'm sure that things have changed probably 7 times since I last looked into it in detail like 2 years ago. So my experience has been that the law is constantly changing, and it's partly difficult, and also people are pretty ambivalent about it. So I had a surprising amount of research participants who would say, yeah, like we could probably get the kids citizenship now, but like, do we really want to? Like, will it really mean anything for them? And I think part of that is because legal non-citizens for a long time have had pretty decent access to public services. So, healthcare, education, but those things are sort of receding as the welfare state recedes in general. So like a few years ago, for example, there were major protests by doctors and nurses and other medical staff because the Andalusian government wanted to stop providing care for undocumented migrants. Basically, they said because of the economic crisis, they were no longer going to extend socialized medicine to non-citizens. And there was so much protest and pushback that they kind of walked that back. But I kind of wonder if as those benefits get sort of more and more pulled from non-citizens, if more people will try to become citizens. It used to be that if you were in Spain for 3 years and can prove residence, you can then become eligible for legal residence, not citizenship, but just like a kind of a card basically that says you're a legal resident and can't be deported. But in practice, it's actually really hard to have all of the documents to prove that you've been living and working. So, yeah, I don't know. It's a good question.
Yeah, it directly relates to how these a variety of issues become identity issues.
Yeah.
And also the overall sort of the difference between France and Spain, things like that. What's the status of a couple years ago? I seem to remember that Spain was flirting with the idea of giving all descendants of Jews who'd been kicked out of Spain citizenship to come back.
Yeah.
And then people said, "Oh, great, let's do it for the Muslims too." And they go,
No.
different.
No, yeah.
So it seems that there is in Spain related to the idea of can one really become a Spaniard? I mean, there's a difference between becoming a citizen with a certain legal status in Spain, but it seems that in France, even though it's obnoxious, there is this idea that you can become French, and part of that will be not wearing a hijab to school and things like that, but all of that is open to people.
Mm-hmm.
Great French tradition of inclusion, whether you like it or not. But in Spain, it seems that kind of parochial universalism
Yeah.
is not expression.
Right, yeah. So one whole chapter of my book is about kind of precisely this issue where, on the one hand, Spaniards have this sort of romantic history telling about the Moorish past. And it seems to be this place that, unlike the rest of Europe, because of their long Muslim history, there's more possibility for the inclusion of Muslims. And yet, even in Granada, this city that's like, the whole economy is based on Moorish heritage tourism, there's a very strong link between the way people think about national identity and regional identity and religious identity. And so it becomes very, very, very difficult for people to be understood as both Spanish and Muslim. And this affects converts in certain ways and migrants in certain ways. But I think, yeah, beyond the sort of legal, political aspects of citizenship, the sense that they will never be accepted as actual Spaniards is, I think, why a lot of people are ambivalent, even when they get to the point where they say, okay, we could petition for citizenship for our kids, but like, what's the point? Because they'll never be considered anything but Moroccan anyway. Yeah, there's not quite the same parochial universalism as you have in France.
As a response to that, was there a response in the Muslim community, whether converts or migrants, to the Latino naturalization?
Oh yeah, sorry, I'm very jet-lagged and tired. I forgot the beginning of your question. Yeah, so there's this law, it's called like the law of return or something, and it actually, it's gone in many unanticipated ways as you would expect for a law like this, right? But it's only for Sephardic people. It's actually pretty hard to prove that you fit into the confines of who can access the law. And because they made it so difficult, many people who initiated the process with Spain are actually now trying to get Portuguese citizenship instead, because Portugal, after Spain, initiated a similar process but made it much easier. But yes, I mean, I was actually surprised when this happened that among the sort of general public and in the news, in the media, there wasn't as much discussion as you might think of like, oh, hey, what about the Muslims? It was like, it was so obvious that this would never happen for Muslims that mainstream news didn't bother to say like, hey, we're only doing this sort of reparation for half of the...
Yeah, it's even more fascinating if you think of the Maghreb as a zone, because all over North Africa there are people who have conspicuously Andalusi identities.
Yeah,
It's
absolutely.
Like, we are from this place in Spain.
Yeah.
And it's not like they were burning to go back either. There's a kind of reciprocal separateness, even though the possibilities for rearticulation are just infinite.
Mm-hmm.
And it kind of amazes me that that certain populations are selected out for rearticulation with the past and other people.
Yes. There is a PhD student in anthropology at the New School whose thesis is all about this this idea of bringing the Jews back to Spain. So I'm excited to see that work when it comes out.
Okay, we'll close the public portion of the course, and
Okay.
those who are in the class can stick around and we'll continue the conversation.
Okay, thanks for your questions.